こんにちは。ここはカリフォルニア州サラトガ市にある箱根園。西半球で最も歴史のある邸宅日本庭園です。I'm Rie Fukuno. I came from Japan to America to study journalism at the grad school. I first visited the Japanese garden in the US 4 years ago. Hearing the water sound from the koi fish pond, I felt as if I went back to Japan. It was surprising for me to find my culture far across the Pacific Ocean. I conducted research on Japanese gardens in the US and found that the Japanese gardens located in Bay Area have significant historical value.
It's perceived to be the oldest in the United States, and its history is very reflective of the relationship between US and Japan over the last 100 years or so. And so there are elements here historically that are really quite significant.
In North America, there are over 250 public Japanese-style gardens. Obviously, this gardening style is very popular here. This garden is part of what inspired that movement, or certainly a part of why there are so many gardens in North America. It's partly due to the popularity of this garden. This garden has been here since 1894, and there aren't many gardens of any style that are that old in the United States.
Hakone became 100 years old in 2015.
Hakone Estate and Gardens is the oldest Asian and Japanese estate gardens in the Western Hemisphere, as designated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Hakone is the only Japanese garden in the Western United States that survived World War II. All the rest of them were destroyed.
California has more Japanese gardens than any other state. But more money and effort are needed to preserve the gardens for future generations. And how important is it for these gardens to be authentic to the Japanese tradition? The people who care for them care deeply.
I'm the coordinator of 2 tea programs here at Hakone.
Thin layers, and when exposed to moisture, it forms kind of a natural plastic. That's the one.
John Laliso is a lifelong San Francisco resident. His ancestors came from Italy and France. Yet, he is committed to passing along the culture that he cultivates in Japanese gardens.
The monthly, third Sunday monthly teas for the general public. And in October we have a tea gathering for the tea practitioners in the Bay Area and anywhere else people want to come from. We've had people from as far away as Kyoto and New York and North Carolina.
Mr. Laliso met Motomi at the tea house in San Francisco, an arranged marriage that has lasted now more than 10 years.
I and my husband live in this San Francisco typical house, but this is a tea room my husband made, and this make me feel relaxed, remind me Japanese house. I was born and brought up in Japanese countryside house. All the rooms are tatami room, so this room remind me a Japanese house, and I feel comfortable.
I'm wearing Japanese clothes because I'm sitting in a Japanese room, sitting Japanese style, so everything fits.
Japanese gardens began sprouting up in the US in the late 1800s, with San Francisco's Golden Gate Park being one of the earliest.
Usually for immigration to occur, there has to be both a push and a pull.
Yeah.
And of course the push in 1868 was the Boshin War, the Meiji Restoration, and then so that pushed out 22 samurai who wanted to, who were on the losing side of that war. And so they immigrated to America with their guide, Mr. Shell, who was actually German.
After the defeat of the samurai, the Japanese new government was trying to promote its culture to the world.
The garden in Golden Gate Park was built for the Midwinter Fair of 1894. And as such, they brought over some gardeners from Japan, and they built the basics of the current garden, which at the time, I believe, actually was labeled as a Japanese village rather than as a garden per se.
This is now known as the Japanese Tea Garden, the oldest public Japanese garden in the United States. But critics say the Japanese culture showcased here is less than authentic.
San Francisco Tea Garden is showing not the real Japanese tea garden.
It's kind of perpetuates kind of a lie about Japanese culture, which is truly unfortunate. What we're afraid of, those of us who practice tea, is that people who come from all over the world, all over the United States, they come to the tea garden in Golden Gate Park and they get a totally wrong idea.
I have memories of here when I was a kid, running through the garden, because there was no admission fee, so we could just run through the place, and we did.
I remember my mom used to like to go there for tea on the weekends sometimes. That was my introduction to Japanese culture. And as I later found out, it wasn't a very good one, or at least not very accurate. For a while, it was under the care of the Hagiwara family, who kept good care of it and actually lived there in the garden. But when they were shipped off to the camps during World War II, quickly went astray.
Teruo Shina is a friend of Mr. Laliso. Mr. Shina researched the Japanese tea garden and found problems.
Originally, there was a shrine in here, but people destroyed the Shinto shrine and the Buddhist pagoda was moved to here. When Japan and America were at war, people destroyed the Shinto shrine where the Japanese emperor was worshipped as a god and replaced it with the Buddhist pagoda behind it. I feel the scar of the war hasn't healed yet.
It was moved about 60 feet, roughly 60 or 70 years ago, at a time when the United States and Japan were at war. And a lot of changes happened then. And because of that, the pagoda's placement today is historically significant. In the American government's view, it therefore can't be moved at this point. It represents a period of historic significance.
Through the 1890s into the early 1900s, a lot of those gardens, fell into disrepair or disappeared just because of, the popularity waned. World War II was also a force that got rid of a lot of gardens of Japanese origin, or of Japanese style, I should say, not necessarily Japanese origin, but Japanese style gardens. A lot of those didn't survive World War II, but this garden did.
They also point out that the pagoda is decrepit.
The pagoda needs to be rebuilt. It was a temporary structure in 1915, and of course, that was nearly 100 years ago. It needs some help.
One of our biggest projects is working on restoring the pagoda behind me, and we're trying to work on getting funding and getting that restored. But I would say a lot of the restoration is kind of ongoing repairs. Annual budget to run the tea garden is around $500,000. The gardening maintenance is probably the highest cost. And then after that really would probably be our maintenance costs and maintaining structures and painting, repairs. There's a lot of specialty structures in here, specialty Japanese carpentry, and so those all need a higher level of maintenance.
John, John, did you notice this one?
Yeah, the concrete.
Concrete on top of the stepping stone.
Yeah.
So now it's flat.
For this one, acrylic fiber paint has been applied, not urushi paint.
The higher one is for putting candle, and the other is for putting a bucket of hot water. And so they have to be within easy reach.
Yes.
And this one, there's only one, and it's kind of far.
They put a tsukubai, a wash basin, and a lantern in the garden, and a really awful copy of what they thought would be the case in a tea garden, but they have everything wrong. They don't know how it functions, and so they don't know what they're doing. It's awful.
Japanese design is not just about how it looks, but the design also has its meanings, including spiritual meanings. So copying only the shape results in merely a design that has no meaning.
That's not quite, real authentic. Yeah. This one has a pagoda in Japanese garden here, but it's sort of painted kind of bright colors. It's kind of faded now, but the original is painting either red or something, which is not really the Japanese style. See? Sometimes there's a structure of the building looks like a Chinese type building, even like a pagoda type things. The Japanese one and Chinese one, there's slight differences. And the people like us, we see it right away, but some of those Japanese Americans, they don't see the differences.
This is a Japanese American tea garden. This tea garden, for the most part, has been managed by Americans. The three gardeners who are really responsible for it today are not Japanese and have no formal training, but they've done an incredible job.
I think the main thing that separates the Japanese garden from other style gardens is the maintenance, paying attention to the details, making sure that the moss is immaculate, pruning all of the trees to be a very specific, I won't say perfect, but a very specific style. And so in that regard, the three gardeners that we have here, we're studying all the time to try to make sure that we have the best skills that we can possess to try to keep the garden as beautiful and as pristine as possible.
Everybody calls it the Japanese tea garden because they serve tea there and so on, but the problem from the standpoint of people who practice the way of tea is there's no Japanese tea garden in the Japanese tea garden. A Japanese tea garden isn't supposed to look like anything. It's supposed to look just like a path in the forest. It should look like nothing at all. It's just conveying the guests into the tea room.
It has a tea house that has been serving tea continuously since 1893. It is apparently where the Chinese fortune cookie was invented.
It's improved a little bit because now at least they have somebody there occasionally doing Japanese tea ceremony, but it's in a very informal arrangement that's a little deceiving as to what the Japanese tea ceremony is all about.
450,000 people visit the Japanese tea garden. They believe this is a very authentic Japanese culture and go back. In fact, to the Japanese people, this is not authentic. From this point of view, I would say it's rather a fake. When people appreciate the garden, as a Japanese, I feel embarrassed.
Now that I know something about Japanese culture, there's some aspects of the garden that are kind of embarrassing.
They have certain knowledge, but they don't really understand authentic, Japanese culture. Just like American people eating sushi, it's not the same as the Japanese people eating sushi. I mean, there's a difference, right? Yeah.
So it has a unique history. When the earthquake happened in 1906 in San Francisco, many of the Japanese Americans that were here in San Francisco came and lived in this tea garden after their homes had been destroyed. So there's a long and colorful history that informs what this is today. And to say it's not Japanese enough or it should be a different way is not really to respect what it has been and what it represents.
In this garden, because we were formed in 1894 and people wanted to see things that were exotic, we imported a lot of plants from Japan. Even some of the stones that we have in this garden are imported from Japan. But I think if the garden were designed today, that's not how it would be done. Even a Japanese-born gardener that designed this garden today would probably use local stones, local plants, local materials to make the garden be authentic to San Francisco. And so that in that sense, it could be an authentic Japanese-style garden in San Francisco.
This garden is very beloved for I think all San Franciscans. I think especially people that grew up here. People when their kids are often brought here, and so it is certainly really a valued landmark and destination for San Franciscans. It also brings in a lot of tourists from out of town as well. I think people really enjoy the tea house and the experience of the Japanese garden. And I think it's part of being one of those really important Japanese gardens that brought this garden style to the United States, and that it's actually Japanese gardening is a really popular garden style in the United States, partly due to this place.
ゴールデンゲートパークに遊びに行って、これが日本の
When I bring my son to the Golden Gate Park and tell him, that's the Japanese building, I feel uneasy because I'm actually showing him a fake. If children's eyes see the fake and consider it as authentic, it's unfortunate. They miss out on feelings of aura emitted from the genuine. The person always exposed to the genuine things has keen sensitivity. But the person who always compromises at an imitation would have dull sensitivity. Doesn't this make a considerable difference in character formation?
そういう人格形成においてかなり差が出てくるんじゃないですか。
Driving south for an hour, you can find Hakone Estate and Gardens.
I feel more relaxed in Hakone Gardens.
There are gates in the garden, and as you progress through the garden, you can get a feeling of separation from the bustling of San Jose on one side, and the quietness of the tea garden on the other.
In the U.S. or Western Hemisphere, nothing like this garden exists. This is a really authentic garden. So it's like a San Francisco Japanese garden. You know, many people say that it's not purely Japanese. It has a mixture of some Asian influence. So we think this is scale-wise not big, but very pretty, authentic Japanese garden. It's just so valued and 100 years old. So if we don't maintain it, it's going to be totally destroyed.
Hakone Gardens were created in the Japanese gardening boom in the 1910s.
It was begun in 1915 by Mrs. Isabel Stein and Oliver Stein, who founded the San Francisco Opera and Ballet. They traveled throughout Japan in 1916 and decided to build these beautiful gardens. They were inspired by the Fujiya Hotel in the town of Hakone. Mrs. Stein brought over and hired Shintana-san and Aihara, were both top landscape architects and architects that built these gardens.
Hakone has undergone hard times, neglected by people.
There were some things that needed to be done. It was overrun with poison oak, so they had it cleared, and they restored the ponds and the waterfall and some did a lot of work on it.
That was in 1999 when I came to this area. There was nobody taking care of this garden. So when I saw it first, I thought I should help maintain this garden.
Mr. Matsuo and his friend created a Japanese committee to help Hakone.
In the past, probably we collected about $400,000 to Hakone. But that is not enough. Hakone needs over $500,000 every year. So we are donating only 10% or less than 10% of Hakone's expense. I think we should do it more to collect more money for Hakone.
Meanwhile, most of the garden's expense is supported by the non-profit Hakone Foundation. Another challenge is daily maintenance.
We have an excellent gardener right now called Jacob. He was trained in Portland Japanese garden for many years, and after he came here, Hakone Garden became much more prettier.
Mr. Matsuo passed the baton to the next leader, Mr. Matsunami.
I'm Japanese, so I know Japanese history or culture more than the local people. Japanese people's contribution to help how Japanese garden looks like. Those are the very important things.
People caring for Hakone over the years have tried to keep it authentic, but they don't pursue 100% authenticity.
One of the gardeners told me that there are a few Mexican plants. He said, Mr. Matsuo, I should take it off. So I told him that if you have 100 of Japanese pretty ladies lined up and then a couple of pretty Mexican ladies in there, and they are mixed together, you don't care, right? He said, I understand. So we didn't take off few Mexican trees, but it's all mixed up. But mostly 99% Japanese.
We try to preserve the most traditional Japanese style garden as long as possible. But Hakone Garden is in here, United States. So the Hakone Garden is influenced from the US culture or US people. And also here, Silicon Valley, many people coming from the different countries. So culture exchange is another thing we would like to pursue. So the kind of a balance, how we can maintain, how we can preserve the real, authentic, beautiful garden, as well as any harmony or, how can I say, culture exchange between the Japanese traditional style and the other cultures. So another challenge is to try to explore the good balance of the traditional beauty of the Hakone Garden as well as culture exchange.
Nearby in San Jose, there's a relatively younger Japanese garden. In 1965, this garden was built as a symbol of everlasting friendship between San Jose and its sister city, Okayama, Japan. Jan Lawson is a park ranger.
I'm jealous of other gardens like Hakone Gardens. They have a big foundation. With the lower budgets, yeah, there's maintenance delays. Japanese fashion, maybe that's not happening as often as we like because we're just trying to keep up with the daily things. We're just trying to maintain the regular beauty of the park.
It was for the sake of the community that we all worked together and built this and show Okayama that we are interested in their program.
Jimmy Yamaichi, Japanese American, volunteered creating the gate.
Our identity is as an American, not as Japanese. The Japan-style gate, but there's an American version. It isn't exactly a Japanese style, but it's close enough, I figure.
Whether it's authentic or not, it's still enjoyable for visitors.
Actually, this is the first place where we met before, 10 years ago. Yeah.
So we took a picture for our wedding right here. Yeah. Actually, I love this place.
あとわずかね、こう手を変えれば。
If a little improvement makes the Japanese tea garden authentic, we would like to make the improvement.
手を変えたいと。
There was a plan to build an authentic tea house in San Francisco's Japanese tea garden.
基本計画まで作ってですね始めたんですが、残念ながらちょうど金融危機が
We made a master plan and started. However, financial crisis happened, and we couldn't find a person to donate the $2 million construction fee. So the plan has been stopped.
中断した形になったんですね。現在はですね
If someone can contribute, I'd like to restart this project immediately.
すぐにでもこのプロジェクトをもう一度復活させたいというふうに考えています。
Maybe in the future we'll get it right. We're not going to stop. We're going to keep on trying. The point of having things like this is to pass on the culture to the next generation. Is to introduce the vast variety of human endeavor to as many people as possible, and of course pass on, your own culture or the cultures that you find valuable onto the next generation. I can't think of anything more important.
Japanese culture in the United States, introduced through the gardens more than 100 years ago, is alive in an American way.